How's it going, guys? Welcome to another video. This one is not going to be out in the field. It's going to be here by my computer, and I want to take you through the process of creating a nightscape, a Milky Way photo. The final result being the one here on this side of the screen. The original photo is this one. So I'm going to be showing you how to go from this point to this point. And not only that, in terms of the editing, but I also want to show you the planning stage. How I found this location in the first place, how I set it up properly, how I found out what the right time of the day would be and right time of the month, and ultimately how I ended up at this picture here. So let's get it all started. So the first spot that I immediately jumped to plan a Milky Way photo like this is Google Earth. And I'll pull it up here. And right now you can't see anything because it's showing nighttime here. But it's a really great resource for planning any of your shots because you get this ground level view. I'll show you daytime real fast here. You get this amazing ground level view showing you what the scene would look like if you were there in real life. And it's pretty accurate, which is pretty cool. And it even shows little bumps of green to show you where trees are. So I found this spot on Google Earth. It's right off a trail. It's called the Yavapai Point off the 179 between the village of Oak Creek and Sedona. And it's facing this cliff here, which is Bell Rock, and this one here, which is the Courthouse Butte. And I noticed that at this time of year, about an hour before sunrise, the Milky Way arches just like that behind those two rock formations, which makes for a really, really cool scene. So I knew I wanted to be in this location facing this direction, and I feel like those two rocks really emphasize the overall beauty of this location, and they really, really give a sense of balance because you have one on each side here. So I knew I had to get there about 5 in the morning to really capture the Milky Way where I wanted it to be. So after I found the spot, I then went to a couple different weather report sites and made sure that it was going to be mostly clear skies the morning that I was going to be there. And indeed, I found a morning that worked out perfectly with my schedule, that I was able to be there when it was partly cloudy skies throughout the night and it was supposed to clear up by sunrise. And that's exactly what happened. And in the final image, as you'll see here, you'll notice that there is a decent cloud formation here, which kind of obstructs the view of the Milky Way just slightly. And a few minutes after this picture was taken, that cloud completely disappeared. And I had taken other shots after the cloud disappeared, and it showed the Milky Way in all its glory with nothing blocking it. But honestly, I felt like the shot here with the cloud actually is kind of better. I just kind of like how it adds an extra layer of depth and contrast and interest to the picture. So once I got there, I got it all set up, and I immediately noticed that I would not be able to fit this entire scene in one frame. Even just this section here, that's about 1 frame's worth in my camera. I was shooting wide open 17mm on a crop sensor camera, Nikon D5300, and that's about 1 frame's worth right there. So I immediately knew that I didn't want to go vertical to get more information in one shot, simply because that would crop out some of the interest in the Milky Way. I wanted to get this entire section of the Milky Way in the picture. And I immediately realized that the best way to do this would be to take one exposure just for the sky area, and then try to take a second exposure for the foreground area down here. And maybe even a third exposure for the rocks and the midground, which ultimately is what I did at the end of the day. And the way I achieved the lightness in the foreground here was with a very, very dim setting on my flashlight while I was taking the long exposure for the foreground, which was probably a good 30 seconds or so. I kind of flashed my flashlight for maybe a second at most across the whole scene, very, very dimly, barely noticeable, and that lit up the scene enough that I was able to pull out all this detail. You'll see in the original image here how dark that this foreground really was, but still I was able to capture all this detail, which is really nice. And the sky itself was a 20-second exposure at ISO 5000. And the midground was the one shot that I did a much longer exposure at a lower ISO to reduce noise, because I really wanted these cliffs to stand out nicely and prominently and not be kind of compromised by all the noise in the shot that you have in the sky. So for the midground, I did a 2-minute exposure at a lower ISO. I think I was around 320 or 400. Still f2.8 and 17 millimeters. And then I combined these three photos. I merged them together in Photoshop to make them one image. And now I'll show you the process of how I got from this point to this point. The first thing I do when editing a photo is jump into Adobe Camera Raw, and from this I then go into Photoshop to do any final touches. So this is the default image here, and it's a little bit more stretched than the final panorama shot that you've seen before. I compressed it just slightly on the left and right sides, and the tree here in the foreground also kind of stretched it a little bit taller because it does feel a little bit wide after merging this panorama. So the first thing I normally do is just bump up the exposure to see what I'm working with here and kind of see how much detail I really have. And you could immediately tell how much light there was in the foreground here from that light source with that very dim flashlight. It really helped bring out some light in the foreground, and that's going to add a lot of depth and detail to this picture. And what I'll normally do for this sort of thing is export this picture 2 times, one for the foreground area, and then I'll export it again for the sky. So the first thing I'm going to do is do all the settings in Adobe Camera Raw just for the foreground. I'm going to completely ignore the sky right now at this point. So I normally bring up my blacks quite a bit just to see how much detail I really have here, bring up the shadows, and bring down the highlights. That gives it a little bit of a softer feel. I'll bring up the whites just a little bit here, and bring the shadows back down and the blacks back down. I don't want it to be too overpowering. I still want to have some darkness there. I'll bring up some vibrance in the color, see how much color I'm working with, and saturation a little bit further down so it doesn't look like an HDR photo. And immediately when I opened this picture, I was able to tell that the temperature was slightly off. It's a little bit too warm. So let's cool it down a little bit by going a little bit more to the blue side. We don't want it too blue because we want these greens in the tree to stay nice and green, not turn into a teal color. That's looking pretty good for the foreground right now. I then will adjust some of the curves here. Let's bring up the darks a little bit more. That looks pretty good for the foreground. I'm not going to worry about the sky, as I said before. And this is a great tool here, Luminance. I'll bring up some luminance so that it reduces the noise that you'll see in the foreground here. So let's bring it up quite a bit here. That's too much, I think. That looks pretty good for the luminance. And then, for now, I think I could ignore adjusting any saturation or luminance in terms of the actual color. I'll probably do this more in Photoshop using Color Effects Pro, the plugin that I have for Photoshop. It does a far better job of color correction in my own experience, generally speaking at least. Split toning we'll leave as is for now. Let's remove the chromatic aberration if there is any. And dehaze, I like this tool a lot. It kind of sharpens things up that are a little bit muddy in the background. I'll bring it up just a slightly, just a tad. That's looking pretty nice. I think I might go back to the curves and try to bump up some of the curves here just a little bit more in the midtones. Not too much, but that's looking really nice. Okay, and remember, this is just for the foreground area. All right, I'm looking at this color here, this brown, and I think I kind of like that to be a little bit more reddish since that it is red rock. So I'm going to adjust the hue. I'm guessing that's in the orange realm, and I'll bring the oranges closer to red. And the yellow's a little bit closer to orange. Okay, that's looking pretty nice. Okay, I think at this point I would open up this image in Photoshop. Let's open it up. This is going to be the foreground for this picture. And now let's open this image up again in Adobe Camera Raw, and we're going to basically adjust things just for the sky now. So we're going to bring down the exposure this time. Bring up the contrast more, because we want to really get that Milky Way nice and pronounced. Bring up the whites quite a bit more. You can already see how much detail there is in the sky there. And the foreground now we obviously don't care about. We'll bring up the shadows just a little bit here. Maybe the blacks can go down, because we want as much detail as we can in that sky. And obviously I feel like the temperature in the sky can go more blue. We don't want it that blue. Whoa, that's way too much. Let's dial it back just a tad here. That's looking really nice. Okay, I feel like at this point, let's go back to our luminance and drop down that noise more, since we're not going to affect the foreground here. We can go a little bit more. That's looking pretty nice. Yeah, I'm liking that. And now I feel like the darks here in the sky, we want to darken the darks in the sky to bring out that Milky Way more, make it much more pronounced. And we'll bring up more of the midtones if there are any. That's looking quite good. And maybe bring up the overall exposure just a bit here. Okay, I'm kind of liking that right now where we're at. Okay, we don't want to do too much more. Let's open up this image in Photoshop, and I'm going to basically blend these two pictures together to create the default image that we're going to be working with here in Photoshop. So we have both images set up. And let's put this one on top of here, on the other one. We don't need this one anymore. And now we're going to work with this image. And we have both layers here. And we're going to basically just blend these together. So the way I'd like to do that is we'll bring the foreground to the front. And we're going to create a mask and basically just drop a gradient over the sky so that we have the sky in the background. I'll just do a default setting right now just to kind of see where we're holding. And already you can see how great this shot is just by doing that slight little adjustment, that gradient mask over the top to bring in the sky from the second layer. Immediately the detail just pounces out at you. Absolutely awesome. So this is a good spot right now where we're holding in Photoshop. I'm not going to do all the tiny little adjustments to make sure that the rocks are perfectly lit up the right way and all the minute details, because that would take a long time. I kind of just want to show you the basic steps that I take to get to the shot. So let's move on to the next step. So this next step is going to combine these two layers together and do all my adjustments in one layer. And what I'm going to do is basically just merge these, and I will save this layer right now as its own layer and not work on it. I'm going to duplicate it so that I'm working on a separate layer, not affecting the original, in case I want to go back and adjust it a little bit more. But I think for right now I actually do want to kind of continue working on that first one. So I'll delete that top one, and I just kind of want to kind of squeeze the whole thing in slightly, because it is a little bit wide. And the reason for that is at 17 millimeters you get just a tad bit of distortion, and especially when merging them together in the tool that I used to merge them, it kind of distorts the overall width and makes it wider than what it would look like in real life. So just kind of gonna shrink this down. Okay, that's looking quite a bit better. Quite a bit more realistic. The tree is definitely not too stretched, which is nice. And I think the next step would be, again, duplicate these layers here. And at this point, it's really just about making small adjustments. But before I make any small adjustments to the little areas of the scene that I want to fix or touch up, I'm going to go to the Nik Collection Color Effects Pro. And what I like to do is add just a little bit of contrast and color in some areas that I want to show to bring more realism and bring more interest into this picture by using some of the tools here. So here we have the image here in Color Effects Pro, and I go straight to the Polarization tool because I find that it really makes the earth tones pop a little bit more, bring them a little bit more brightness to it, and the sky just adds more contrast. So I really like using it quite a bit. I set it right in the middle and the most strength possible, and I'm just going to play with the shadows and highlights here just to see what kind of tones I like. And immediately you could see that if I'm at 0% on shadows and then go up to 100%, look at all that extra detail you see in the sky there. Those stars just really, really come out when that's at a higher percentage. And highlights, let's see the difference between 100% and 0. And for the highlights, I want to go down closer to 0 because when it's at 100%, it's all kind of muted. And when you bring this down, look at all that extra brightness that it brings to the scene. Quite nice. One thing I don't really like is how bright this section here is of this cliff. So I'm probably going to bring that back down later. But I like the brightness in the rest of the scene. So we'll keep that setting as is for polarization. And I feel like that's probably all I want to do at this point in terms of using Color Effects Pro. I don't want to do too much. I don't want to alter the scene too much because once you start altering it, you run the risk of really changing the natural feel to the picture, especially when it's a Milky Way shot. And there's so much room for interpretation. So let's click OK. Bring this back here into Photoshop. And here we have the image from Color Effects Pro back into our Photoshop layer. You can see the difference right here. This is with the polarizer effect, and this is without. It's just that extra little hint of brightness there overall. And it really does add quite a bit. I was going to take this section out here. That brightness I'm not such a big fan of. So let's create a mask for this layer and get our brush and just kind of try to bring this back down because it was a little bit too bright using that tool. There we go, that's a bit better there. It's also quite a bit bright in this immediate foreground area, so let's bring up the brush size. And we don't want it black, we'll want a little shade of a gray here. I'm just going to brush out that foreground, just make it just a drop darker. Okay, I think that's working quite well. One thing I'm noticing is the sky is very purple. So what I'm going to do is just merge these layers. I still have my original. And I'm going to try to adjust the sky to make it a little bit less purple because that's not super realistic. So I'm basically going to go to my color balance here and adjust it. A little too much magenta. Let's bring the greens back in a bit. There you go. You can already tell that's helping quite a bit in the sky. I'm not going to worry about the foreground for now. That helps quite a lot in the sky. And instead of blue, I'll add some yellow back into the sky. There we go. I feel like that works. And what I'm going to do now is mask out the foreground. So I still have the foreground from the previous layer, but I'll be using the sky from this layer. And you can already see, look at that. This is the purple sky, and it's way too purple and fake. And just that slight color tone just brings it back a little bit and adds that hint of bluish, blackish sky, which is much more realistic, much more to my taste. You still have color in the Milky Way, which is great. So while we're at this step here, this is a good point to stop with overall adjustments, and now we're going to start focusing on local adjustments in terms of adding some glow here to emphasize the light coming from the village of Oak Creek and removing a few things that I don't like from the scene. Small little adjustments. All right, so this next step is going to be adding a little bit of an extra glow in this area here from the village of Oak Creek and really emphasizing that glow because a lot of really, really good nightscape images with the Milky Way come to life and just add this painterly feel almost when there is little hints of glowing light throughout the scene, or at least from one area in the scene. And not only does it add a little bit of extra drama and this painterly feel, but it also helps to get rid of some of the noise that you'll see here because a soft glow of light just kind of hides all that noise, and it's a really, really helpful technique. So what I'm going to do here is add a new layer, a blank layer here, and I'm going to go to my gradient, and I'm just going to add a little bit of a yellowish whitish gradient here. I'm going to take it from this color here, which I guess was white. I'll make it a little bit more yellowish orange. We'll start about here, and I want the final outer area to be just straight up white. And we're basically just going to create a circular gradient here of light coming from this area. And okay, actually it needs to be more soft in the outside section here, so I'm going to go to my filter, blur, Gaussian blur. I'm just going to extend that outer area so it kind of just blends nicely into the scene. I don't want it too much. I'd say that's about good. And let's just try to move it up a little bit. That's working really well, and obviously we don't want it to show up like this because you really see it very pronounced. So let's try a few different techniques in terms of blending the two layers together. If we do an overlay, that kind of works. Let's try a soft light. I really like the soft light because it keeps all the detail behind it, but it still very much brightens up that section, and it adds just a slight better glow, as you could tell in that corner there. I'm just going to add a second duplicate layer of that just to kind of make it more pronounced. Okay, and at this point I think I want to add a little bit more of a centralized glow in the center point where that light source is. So let's go straight up white now and just kind of make that small little circle here, that gradient. And again, we're going to blur the outer edges and soft light overlay. That's looking really, really nice right there in that edge. Okay, so once we did those adjustments, I think I still want to work on reducing noise, because you see quite a bit of noise showing up as we zoom in here in the cliffs and of course in the sky. Particularly these clouds have quite a lot of noise. So for now, I'm just going to combine all these layers here and duplicate them so I'm not working on back on my original layer here. And now I'm going to work on reducing the noise. So I like to go to this tool, Filter, Noise, Reduce Noise. And for this tool, I like basically going all the way. Strength 10, don't preserve details, reduce all the color noise, don't sharpen anything, remove the JPEG artifact. And I'll click OK, and that's going to take it quite to the extreme in terms of reducing noise, and it loses a bit of detail. But then what I like to do is bring the detail back by masking out this layer in the areas of the image that I want to show detail. So I'll just click OK, and there we go. This is the layer with the reduced noise, and as you can tell, quite a bit of detail has been lost, and you can see the difference in terms of the noise levels. This is without noise, that's with noise. You can see we lost some stars, we lost some detail here in the rocks, and we lost some details in the foreground rocks and that tree. So I'm going to now mask out some sections here in this layer to bring back some detail, while also reducing noise in some of the areas where we don't want to see anything. So let's create that mask. Use a black brush. And I'm going to use quite a large size here. How that works. And I'm just going to kind of mask out some sections that I want to keep detail in. So those cliffs, this tree I want to keep my detail, and this foreground rock, I definitely want to keep detail in that foreground rock. That's working quite well. That's fine. I want to bring back detail in the stars up here and the Milky Way, but I don't want to show detail in this cloud. The cloud could pretty much be just a blob of that color. That works for me, because that's what a cloud really is. That's working quite well. in terms of the noise levels being reduced. It's working, and we still kept a lot of our detail here, which is nice. So I think at this point we'll just do a couple more adjustments until we have our final product. As I said before, I'm not going to go into depth and detail and do every little inch and section of this image to get it perfect. That'll take a long time. I probably spent at least 2 to 3 hours working on that image to make it the way I wanted it to look. But I'll show you basically what I was doing. At this point, I'm going to combine these two layers here. And you can really see where we took it from this being the original image that we exported into Photoshop after blending, and we took it all the way to here, which is quite a dramatic increase in terms of the life and depth and beauty of this image. One thing I'm noticing immediately is that I prefer the clouds color in this image, in this layer, as opposed to the one we're working in right now. It's a little bit too brown. So I'm basically going to just mask out the clouds from this layer so that you can see the color from the clouds from the layer underneath, because I really prefer those clouds in that bottom layer. So I'm just going to kind of do it very, very subtly there. And maybe a little bit too much purple here in the edges. So that's kind of working quite a bit, I would say. That's working nicely. And at this point, we're going to merge these layers. That's the image where we're now going to be working in. And let's do a couple more adjustments here before we finish up. One thing that I did was definitely need to basically narrow the image quite a bit more, because this is not a very good orientation here. It needs to be definitely showing that it's a vertical shot. So for this, I don't want to warp the rocks at all, because the rocks are naturally, that's how wide they are. So I'm just going to crop it a little bit around the edges first. That's looking nice. And then at this point, I think I'm just going to extend everything quite a bit further down. That tree can be stretched a little bit more, just to make it a little bit more natural looking, and have that corner line up beautifully into the corner of the image. Click OK there, and that's looking quite nice now. I think at this point I'm going to work on bringing up some light in this foreground rock, and also, if you notice in the final image, what I did was add some highlights to the edges of these leaves on the tree, as if the light source here is kind of lighting up the edges of this tree here, as opposed to being lit from in front. So let's create a new layer here, and I'm going to use my curves, and I'm going to bring up all the color and lightness here in the rocks, and bring down the darks just to give a little more contrast up here in the foreground area. I don't care about the sky or the rocks at this point. I'm just working down here. So this rock is looking great, but the tree is not working so well for me. So what I'm going to do is just use this layer for my rock in the foreground. So let's go back to the other gradient. And I want to keep that rock, but I don't want to use that tree, so I'm just masking everything else out except for that rock. You can see it's quite a lot brighter and nicer. So let's duplicate this one, merge these together, and now I'm working in this layer here. I think what I'm going to do now is do some dodging and burning. This tree, I really don't want the light source to be facing the viewer. Kind of want to darken this area up and have only the light source appear like it's coming from the light source in the distance there. So I'm just going to darken all the portions of the tree that are facing the viewer. Obviously I'm doing this extremely fast and not being very accurate here in my lighting, but I just want to kind of show you basically what I'm trying to achieve. And I'll show you the final image again later on. The original final image that I was working on before, and see how I got the light to work in my favor here. But I'm just darkening the areas of the tree that are facing me. and trying to leave the edges bright because that's where the light source is hitting. You always need to work with the light when you're doing dodging and burning. You don't want it to start looking unrealistic. Okay, might have taken it a little bit too far there, so I'm just going to dial it back just a bit here by masking out, just very slightly masking out some of that dark section there in the tree. Just my brush. That's working for me, definitely much better. I'm going to merge these layers together. Now I'm working on this layer, duplicate it. Okay, that's working for me quite a bit. And now I'm just going to lighten up the edges of that tree to enhance the effect of the lighting from the village of Oak Creek, how it's kind of just hitting the edges of these trees just a bit. I don't want it to go too far here. Just a bit, just to give the impression that this tree is being softly lit by that light source in the distance. And I feel like that works really nicely. Another thing is the light source should be hitting this section of the rock much more than the immediate foreground. So I'm just going to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to darken this foreground area because it's quite a bit bright, much brighter than I wanted it to be. Oops. That's working for me, and we're just going to mask out everything except for that extreme bottom portion of the rock there, and that definitely helps, maybe not that much, so let's bring down the opacity just a bit. That's working nicely. Oops, I want to merge all of them. Let's just merge those layers. Okay, this is working quite well. You can still see some purple in the sky there. That I would fix that, and I would fix some of the pinkish purplish hue coming off this light source hitting these trees down here. I would fix that up. But overall, I feel like this image is kind of where I wanted it to take it. So let's now compare this image with the original image that I had here to show you. We took it from here to here, which is pretty incredible, with not too much time. And obviously if you spend a little bit more time on it, you will get it to this point, which is where I took the image myself. But that's pretty much how I go through my process when doing my Milky Way shots from beginning to end. So thank you so much for watching this video, guys. I really appreciate it, and I will catch you on my next video. Till then, out.